Which size? What size?
It looks like double A.
If that's all right. There we go. Okay. I thought that felt a little light when I picked it up. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the East Main Church of Christ. It's good to see you all here this morning. It's good to be back with you. If you're live streaming with us, I'd like to welcome you, and we're glad that you've joined us. And if you are visiting with us, you are our special guest. Excuse me, there we go. All right. And if you're visiting with us, you're our special guest. We ask that you introduce yourself to us so we can get to know who you are, and we're happy that you're here. Before we begin class, I've asked Brother Tenpenny if he'd lead us in a quick word of prayer.
Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank Thee for this beautiful Lord's Day that we could gather here to study another portion of Thy Word. Father, we ask that as we go through this class that we will take the things that we hear today and that we will use them in our hearts and in our lives. And that we ask that You be with Brother Jeff and that he will have a good recollection of the things that he has studied, that he will present it to us in a manner that we can understand. Father, we ask that You go with us through the rest of this day. Give us a home with Thee in the end, in heaven, in Christ's name. Amen.
All right. So this morning we are in chapter 19 of the book of Acts. And we'll start in verse 23. There we go. All right. So we'll be down around verse 23. So I was going to go back and start at the beginning and just kind of walk us through and all that, but I thought the subject matter here, starting in verse 23, has changed. It's totally changed, so there's really no need to go back. So we'll just pick up right here at verse 23. And Brother Greg, if you don't mind, let's read verses 23 through 27, please.
And about that time there arose a great commotion about the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed from all Asia and the world worship.
Okay. If we look on our map, so it says Paul's third missionary journey, and below that it says Asia. If you just go straight over to the left to the coast, you'll see the city of Ephesus on the map. Okay, that's where Paul is. So we're still in Ephesus. He's been there for a while. Okay, and now this disturbance it started about the way or Christianity. Okay, so there's a disturbance. And I think we've seen a little bit of this before, but a man named Demetrius, he's a silversmith, right? He makes shrines to Artemis. Okay, so let me change our slide here. So Artemis, if you're reading the King James version, it says Diana. Okay, so the Greek Empire came first, and they had the Greek gods. When the Romans took them over, basically they incorporated those Greek gods into the Roman society, and they renamed the gods. There may be slight differences in their belief of those gods, but that's what happened. Is the Romans absorbed the Greek gods. So Diana would be a Greek, that'd be a Greek god versus Artemis would be the Roman god. Okay, that's just the difference in the name. That's all it is. So Artemis then, we have a little bit of a hint here in verse 27, but I'll read to you. The article is quite long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read a little bit from Holman's Bible Dictionary about Artemis as it relates to what we're talking about this morning. And it says that Artemis, or Diana, is the patron goddess of Ephesus. Okay, so we're in Ephesus, and Diana is the main goddess of Ephesus. Right? You don't want to mess around with that. We'll see a little bit later on in the next few verses from 28 onward. Hopefully I'll remember to circle back on that. But anyway, you may have seen the picture. It depends. Some outside of Ephesus depict her as a young woman, and then I believe in Ephesus they depict her as an older woman, And many of you have seen the pictures are famous. I don't want to describe it. We're in mixed company, so I don't want to describe it. But she's a fertility goddess, okay? So anyway, it says then the most famous statue of Artemis was located in Ephesus. Okay, so that's where we are. That's where Paul is. He's in Ephesus. And the official temple keeper for Artemis. So Ephesus is the main center for this god, okay? And if I continue on, Artemis was the chief deity of Ephesus. Her temple was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So if you remember back in school, we talked about the 7 wonders of the world. Okay, now this is just an artist's rendition, obviously. That's not the real one. But it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was very large, and then her statue was inside of it. Okay, so anyway, that's one of the 7 wonders of the world, of the ancient world. And then temple ceremonies were carried out by priests who were eunuchs and priestesses who were virgins. So they're the ones that did the ceremonies. They conducted daily ceremonies caring for the deity and for the gifts brought by worshipers. I mentioned to you before when I lived in Japan, people would bring food or drink or things like that to the temples and they would leave it there. It's very similar thing here. People would bring things to leave to the god, or in this case, the goddess. And there were people who took care of the ceremonies, and they took care of those things that were brought, and that kind of thing. So that's what went on around her. And then let's see, there was an annual festival on May 25th when numerous statues of the goddess were carried in procession to the amphitheater in Ephesus. I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. And they had a big celebration of music and dancing and drama. Okay, so on May 25th, they'd have a big party and all of that for Diana. Okay, and then the note here in Holman's Bible Dictionary is this could be the background of the outcry we'll see in verse 28 when the people cry out, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." So it could be during this time. What we're reading here could be around May 25th, and they're having this big celebration, and we'll see what happens here in a little bit later on. But anyway, that's what's going on around Artemis. And I changed those around. Artemis is the Greek god, and Diana was the Roman god. So I had those changed around a little bit there. And then Holman's also mentions that in Acts, the silversmith named Demetrius rallied support against Paul for preaching the gospel for fear of the damage it might do to his business. So anyway, I just thought I'd read you a little bit about Artemis from Holman's Bible Dictionary. Okay, so that's just a little bit about her. So you can see it's a big thing. Artemis is a big deal in Ephesus, and that's where we are. So let's go over then, or go back to verse 24 in Acts chapter 19. So this man named Demetrius, he's a silversmith. Okay, I don't know if he carves or casts, probably casts, but maybe casts and then carves. I'm not sure how he does that. And it says that and he made silver shrines. Now, I did some more study. I don't want to have to read all of it to you, but some of the shrines he made were of this temple and also of the god or the goddess herself. So they would make these figurine type things like that, and they would sell it, or he would sell it. But there's a whole, if we look at verse 25, it says, these he gathered together. Well, I'm sorry, at the end of 24, it says it brought no little business to the craftsmen. So Demetrius is not the only one doing this. There's a whole industry around these shrines and figurines and statues and things like that to the goddess Artemis. It reminds me, when I went to the Vatican, it's been a long time ago, but I went up to the Vatican, and all around the Vatican, around Vatican City, like that, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there's a line when you actually walk up, and you've seen it on TV. It's like this big round courtyard with this obelisk type thing right in the middle. And there's actually some type of brick on the ground like that, showing you that when you step over that, you've left Italy and you're in Vatican City. You're in it's its own country. So outside of that, in Italy, outside of the Vatican itself, there's all these souvenir shops all around it. And they have, rosary beads and crucifixes and all that. There's a whole industry of things going on around the Vatican. So if you've been there and saw that, that's what this reminds me of, is there's a whole industry around this temple and Artemis and the worship of Artemis and the ceremonies and all of this kind of stuff. So there's a whole industry. And it says here that we've read about Demetrius, but it says that there are craftsmen. So there's more than one. So in verse 25 then, so these craftsmen, then Demetrius gathered them together, and it says with workmen in similar trades. So we're talking, Demetrius is a silversmith, but there's probably other things that go on as well, other types of things. I don't know if it's woodworking, but I'm sure there are goldsmiths, and we have silversmiths, and whatever it is. But it said there are workmen in similar trades also. And like I said, there's a whole industry around this. And Demetrius, he gathers them together, and he says, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. So these men have become wealthy from this industry around the temple and around Artemis and the worship of Artemis and all of that. There's a whole, like I said, a whole industry, and these guys that's where they get their income or their wealth is from this. And so in verse 26 then, he says, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia. So let me back the slide up just a minute. And if we look at our slide, if you remember where Ephesus is on that coastline there, just look back to that's actually modern-day Turkey. It's known as Asia Minor. Okay, so Demetrius is saying, look, it's not just in Ephesus where we make all of this money, but it's in all of Asia. It's not just the people in Ephesus who worship Diana. It's people in all of Asia. And we'll see that last verse, 27, it says, and the world. So if you remember a couple weeks back when we talked about Ephesus, it's a major city. People pass through Ephesus all the time with trade, and there's, if you look in the middle of the screen to the far right where it says Antioch, and you just follow that line. See, Paul went overland when he left Antioch. He went overland to Ephesus. So there are land routes through Asia. There's also, if you look a little bit south, you see these sea routes, right, coming out of Ephesus and to the north of Ephesus and things like that. So people are passing through, going and coming. Okay, and so information about Artemis and the worship and all of that, as people pass through, they see it and they learn about it, and that gets carried with them to different parts of the world. So that's what he's saying here then when he says in verse 26 that you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, so all of that area, then it says that this Paul, okay, and if I stop a minute and we look at Antioch and just go over land again, you see all those cities there where Paul went through teaching and planting churches and things like that. We've studied that in previous chapters. So he's saying in all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people. So these men then, who make these temples and statues and things like that, they're losing their income because Paul, he's saying, has turned many people away. He's teaching them about God and about Christ, and people are and other things that he's teaching, but he's saying, if you remember back when he was in Athens, Paul talked about God doesn't live in these temples made with hands. And he's not a God that's made with hands. If you remember that discourse that Paul gave. So Paul is saying, look, men are making these things. These are just things made by men. They're not gods. They're not true gods. And Paul taught the true God. So these men are losing their income because of what Paul is preaching. And it says here that he's turned a great many people away, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. Okay, so that's what Paul is teaching. Now, my question to you is that what Paul was teaching? Yeah, that's what Paul was teaching. What they're accusing Paul of is true. So they're not making anything up. They're teaching, they're accusing him of what he's actually really doing. So he goes on then in verse 27, and he says, and there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute. So not only if we're not careful, if this gets out of hand, not only are we going to start losing our income, or when Paul says these are not gods, they're just made with hands, then eventually people are going to, let's say Demetrius is trying to say, here, buy my silver figure, and people will be like, that's just man-made. There's nothing to that. That's what he's saying. It falls into disrepute. So there's a danger that their industry there would fall into disrepute. And it says not only that, but as he goes on, but also the temple of this great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing. So he's not only worried about losing his income and that whole industry falling into disrepute, but as people come to Ephesus, they say, oh, you know what, that's just made by hand. That's a really nice building that somebody made. That kind of thing. And it takes away from I don't know, I don't want to call it sanctity, but it takes away from the worship of that God and that the importance of that temple and things like that. So Demetrius is worried that, not only am I going to lose my income, but this whole thing, the whole industry can fall apart, and Artemis's importance in the world, and that temple, one of the 7 wonders of the world, may also be counted as not as important as things go on. So that's what he's blaming Paul with. Okay, and then also he says that the temple to the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that that would be Artemis, and that she may be deposed from her magnificence. Okay, so that's what he's worried about, is this whole thing collapsing. And then it says here at the end, she whom all Asia, we talked about that already, let me back up, Asia Minor, that's modern-day Turkey, and the world worship. So Ephesus would be in Asia. So it's not just Ephesus, not just Asia, but he's saying the whole world, as people pass through, and perhaps, they were selling figurines or, say silver or gold models of the temple to the ship people as they come through, and they would take that, maybe a big load or whatever, how they did that. They would take that somewhere else in the world and sell that. So this is the temple of Artemis from Ephesus, and they would sell that. So he's worried that this whole industry, if we're not careful, he's saying there's a danger that this whole industry is going to collapse. Okay, so that's what he's worried about there. And let's see, I think I've covered everything in my notes. So this caused a great disturbance then throughout Ephesus. Okay, any comments or questions there? Okay, we've got Brother Wynn down here. Did you have a comment, Jim? Well, I'll get you, Mike. Let me let Brother Wynn. Go ahead, Brother Wynn.
The way he describes, that Demetrius is describing this, sort of reminds me of here locally, the way people, hold up like the Ryman Auditorium,
The Mother Church?
Yeah. Yeah. So, if someone said, country music isn't really from the Ryman, it's from this place, and, you've got this whole industry in Nashville built around this, and if someone, were to, do something, like Paul and say, this isn't really, the whole thing, this isn't, that great a deal, there's something better, than, that you can imagine what type of reaction that would get.
Oh, if country music fell out of favor, it would wipe out Nashville, probably, especially along Broadway down there.
Yeah. So you can sort of take that to modern times, how people would react.
That's right. That's good. Jim?
In the same light and lightness of what was just said about Nashville, you just think all these people that was traveling through there and throughout the world, they had that hanging on their rear view mirrors, the souvenirs from there.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Perhaps they were selling those things to the shippers, as they would come through, and then they would get to wherever they were going, and they would sell those, little models or whatever it was, that they were doing. So yeah, it's a massive trade. Okay, it's a massive trade, and that's a good point too. If someone from Ephesus was going somewhere else to live, they might take a little statue of Diana or that temple with them, and they would set up a little shrine in their house and continue to worship the goddess there. Okay, we have a comment here. And I've seen that in Asia, by the way.
Also, when Rome supposedly conquered the world, the people they conquered who wanted to benefit from them being there, they would want to do as the Romans. So if the Romans worship this idol, that's what they're going to do. And so, it's kind of like if we want to be like somebody else, then we try to copy and do what the other person does. And that was happening also all throughout the Roman world.
Right, that's right. Right behind you there.
I need to get my 2 bits in right here. I was thinking of when you were talking about Demetrius and what he was talking with the other people who traded their goods. Evidently, it had already had some kind of effect on their industry. It wasn't he was just thinking it's going to have an effect if we don't do something about it.
Yeah.
But I think it was already having an effect.
Yeah, I think so too. That's probably what got them stirred up.
So you just imagine how many people were coming to Christ because of that. I mean, it had already, the Christians had already hurt their business. And I think that would, just think about, I was reading that just this week because I'm over in the New Testament now. I've already read through the Old and I'm getting to the New now. And where Paul preached that sermon and that, that was some of the things that he was talking about, that the people were coming to Christ just by the thousands. So it was hurting the industry. So it wasn't like, well, this might hurt, but it was hurting.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Any other comments or questions on these? Because we'll move on and we'll see. And by the way, if you're in the balcony, if you raise your hand and just yell out, hey, you or something, we'll get a microphone up to you. I don't want to forget you guys up there. Okay. All right, let's see what happened then. Brother Greg, let's just read verses 28 to 34, please.
Now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. And when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. And some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him, pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, Great is Diana of the Ephesians.
Okay. So the artisans then, Demetrius and those craftsmen that we talked about, so they became enraged. And the confusion, so you see here, confusion filled the city. And then the scripture says that some people, they really didn't even know what was going on, but they kind of followed the crowd. And you will see that in a second. So you've got the crowd is getting all worked up. And like we said, it was confusing. Some people didn't even know why am I here? It's just like I'm in the crowd. I just went along to see what was happening. Okay, and things like that. But they dragged Gaius and Aristarchus, they're both from Macedonia. They dragged them into the theater. Okay, so this is the ruins of the theater in Ephesus. Okay, and just so you know, for some reason, they weren't able to find Paul. So they grabbed whoever they could. And we see they weren't able, for whatever reason, they weren't able to find Paul and grab him. Now, this theater was used, so I find this is interesting, it's just how my mind thinks, I guess. So this is the ruins of the theater, but this is where they put people to death. Okay, back in Ephesus, what it was, they put people to death in this theater. So they grabbed these two guys, Gaius and Aristarchus, and they dragged them into this theater. And then that'll be that. So let me drop down to verse 30 and 31. So let me just make sure I didn't miss anything there. So then as they were dragging them into the theater, then in verse 28, people were shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." You see people shouting this out, okay? And they do this more than once, so they're shouting out. It's almost like what we see on TV sometimes, people shouting out, and they do what I call the Palestinian salute when they fire their automatic AK-47 into the air, and stuff, and woo, and everybody's all worked up, right? And they grab these guys and they go into this theater right here. So you can imagine if you were Gaius or Aristarchus, especially if they knew what went on in this theater, they could be very worried at this point. But anyway, they were dragged in there, and then Paul. But look at verse 30. Paul wished to go in among the crowd. Okay, so Paul he wanted to go and help. He said, "Hey, I'm gonna go help these guys out. I'm not gonna, I'm the one preaching. Why should they be dragged into this theater and killed? I want to go help them out." So it says there in verse 30, Paul wished to go in among the crowd, but the disciples wouldn't let him. They're telling him, no, you don't go in there like that. I guess they're thinking it would be sure death for Paul if he were to go into that crowd like that. And they wouldn't let him go in there. And look at verse 31. Even some of the Asiarchs. So I'm reading the ESV there. The New King James says that some officials of Asia. So your modern translation may say Asiarchs. When I looked that up, it says that an Asiarch is an officer in the province of Asia, as in other eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. They were selected with others from the more opulent citizens to preside over the things pertaining to religious worship and to exhibit annual public games at their own expense in honor of the gods in the manner of Rome. Okay, so they're officials, and their job is to oversee, I guess, like we were talking about the worship of Artemis in the temple. So they kind of had something to do with that. Also the Roman games, right? They kind of oversaw that, so they officiated and things like that. So that's what they did. Now notice the scripture here in verse 31, it says they were friends of Paul. Okay, so these Asiarchs, or these officials then, they were friends of Paul. Okay, and they sent to Paul urging him, do not go into the theater. Okay, so the disciples are telling Paul wherever he is, for whatever reason, they weren't able to find Paul and drag him in there. But Paul says, I'm going, and the disciples are saying, no, you're not, and they're holding him back. And even these officials are saying, they sent word, go tell Paul, do not come into this theater. Okay, and it would be, I think they were thinking, surely he would be killed if he did. So they're telling him, don't come into this theater. Okay, so then in verse 32, then this is part of that confusion, that some cried out one thing, right? Others cried out something else, and the assembly was in confusion. So you had Demetrius and his group, they knew why they were there. They're upset about losing business, and we talked about that a little while ago. But there are also people there who just kind of got caught up in it, and they were brought in, and they didn't know why they were there. And that's at the end of verse 32. Most of them did not know why they had come together. So they just kind of got caught up in it, and they went on in there. Now, some of the crowd then prompted Alexander, okay, whom the Jews had put forward. So these men, or some of the men pulled in there, they're Jewish. Okay, and they put Alexander forward. Here, you get up there and you talk to the crowd. Okay, and the thing about it is that the Ephesians knew that the Jews opposed the worship of these other gods, these foreign gods, because the Jews worship the one true God. So they opposed all of this idol worship and these temples that we looked at a minute ago. They opposed that. So they put Alexander up there. The people know he's a Jew. They know Jews don't support this worship like this, so he's not going to calm anybody down. Okay, so anyway, they put him up there, and it says then whom the Jews put forward, and Alexander then motioning with his hand, then he wanted to make a defense to the crowd. He wanted to explain, here's what's going on, here's what we're teaching, or whatever he wanted to say, but he was going to make a defense. Okay, and it says, but now this backs up what I mentioned just a second ago, verse 34. When they recognized that he was a Jew. Okay, so when they recognized he was a Jew, then for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So they just start that, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and they shouted him down, kind of what we see going on in our country today in a way. They're shouting him down. We don't want to hear what you have to say, right? We know you're a Jew. We know what you think about all of this stuff, and they're just shouting him down. Okay, so that's what's going on there in that theater, okay, for about 2 hours, it says. So one thing I wanted to mention here, then in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, Paul, I have my note here, it says, Paul probably had set in his mind to go up to help his friends, even if he had to die. He wrote, because of that comment in 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 11, you kind of get a little bit of a state of mind of Paul during this event, what happened here. So it says that it seems like that Paul wanted to go up and help his friend, even though he knew that he would probably be killed. He wanted to go help them anyway. So that kind of speaks to his state of mind. And then we talked about 32 through 34, that the assembly was confused and that Alexander, he wanted to address the crowd. And I mentioned that they knew the Jews opposed idols and things like that, and that's why they wouldn't let him speak. And then let's see, then because Paul and many of those who were with him were Jews, then the Jews would have been afraid that of the crowd's wrath towards Paul and his companions, and one thing they were afraid of is that this could spill over into the whole city. Okay, so the Jews of Ephesus were, so just, if you think about, we talk about it from time to time, that early on in the Roman Empire, the Christians were lumped into the same category with the Jews. Okay, and then it was only later that people realized, okay, these are two separate religions, or two separate things. So here in Ephesus at this time, let's say you're a Jew in the synagogue, and we read back just before verse 23 where we started. If you just read back a little bit, Paul went in the synagogue and he taught for 3 months. He didn't really have he had some success, but the Jews opposed him, and they stirred up the crowds against him. We see that in every city where he goes. So put yourself in the position of one of those Jews. You don't believe Paul. You don't have anything to do with Paul. Just go away. And remember, if you remember, he took his disciples and they went somewhere else to teach. What if you're one of those Jews? Okay, you may be afraid that Paul is riling up the crowd against these Jews, Paul and his friends who are Jewish, but that this thing could spill over into the whole city, and it could affect all the Jews in the city, whether they believe Paul or not. So that was also something to consider. If you were a Jew who opposed Paul, you were still at risk, because if the people got angry enough with Paul and his crowd, then that could just come right on out into the city, and any Jew could be persecuted. So that was also going on as well. Okay, and so that we can read about there a little bit from 32 to 34. And I think that is where we left off. Yes. So let me stop there. So are there any comments or questions here? So we're in the theater. Okay, the people are riled, the people are chanting, and it doesn't look good for Paul and his companions. Go ahead.
There's a predominant attitude about any riotous situation during this time under the Roman Empire. If you caused a commotion and Rome got wind of it, you've already pointed out that they'd send soldiers in to shut it down. And they didn't want anything to happen, even here, which was part of Roman territory. It wasn't back in Jerusalem, but in Judea and everything. But still, the same attitude that was prevalent in Judea takes place here. They don't want to upset the Roman authorities to the point that they send in soldiers here to shut it down.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to hold that thought until we read these next few verses, and then we're going to talk about that. Is there any other comments or question about what we've read? Okay, Brother Greg, let's just read 35 right on out through the end of the chapter.
And when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Zeus? Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly.
Okay, so we're in that theater. People are chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." You've got some Jews in there. Paul's not there, but you have some of his Jewish friends are in there, and it's not looking good. And then this town clerk steps in, and the New King James says the city clerk. So he steps in and he quietens the crowd down. Now, I don't know if he was recognized. It must have been recognized for them to quieten down. Now, remember, that went on for 2 hours. All that chanting and all that stuff was going on for 2 hours. So he goes in and he finally gets the town quiet. Okay, and then it says, then what he says there is, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of Ephesus is temple keeper of the great Artemis? So we talked about that when we were back on the previous slide, and we were just talking about Artemis, who she was, why she was so important to Ephesus, and the main goddess there of Ephesus and all of that. So then what the city official is saying here is, who doesn't know this? Right? This is such common knowledge. And I mentioned it, the people, the tradespeople coming through Ephesus and seeing one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, maybe even buying figurines and things. We talked about that earlier. So he's saying, who doesn't know? Okay, everybody knows this, that she's this important. So I think he's trying to tell Demetrius and his group there that you don't have anything to worry about. Everybody knows this, right? So he's trying to calm the crowd down, okay? And he says, then he goes on, we see a little bit more that it says the keeper of the great Artemis and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky. So there's some sacred stone that they probably worshiped also in connection with all of this. Okay, so he's saying this is common knowledge. Everybody knows about this. Okay, so then in verse 36, then, seeing that these things cannot be denied, okay, it's such common knowledge you can't deny it. He's saying then you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. Just calm down, okay? Everybody knows how great Artemis is. Everybody knows how great that temple is, okay, and that stone that fell from the sky. Everybody knows this. Okay, calm down. Right? This isn't going away. And now remember, over a 2-hour period, what we read earlier about Demetrius was worried about losing his income over a period of time from here, that could have turned into a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, so he's just telling them to calm down. Your business is not going away. The temple is not going away. Okay, Artemis's stature in the world is not going away. Okay, everybody knows this, so just calm down. Is what he's saying here. And then he said, and these things can't be denied. Okay, and then there in verse 37, then, this is the good part of the Roman law. For you have brought these men here, now I'm going to read from the ESV, who are neither sacrilegious. Now that sacrilegious is from the standpoint of Artemis. Okay, they're not sacrilegious and they're committing sacrilege against Artemis. If we read in the New King James, it says that they are neither robbers of temples. Okay, so they're not robbing the temple. They're not committing sacrilege against the goddess. Okay, that's what he's saying. Okay, so you brought them here. And then also the New King James says they're not blaspheming, and actually the ESV does too, nor are they blaspheming against Artemis. So they're not robbing the temple. They're not committing sacrilege, trying to destroy the temple or anything like that. They're not committing blasphemy against Artemis or anything like that. Okay, and so he's trying to tell them, calm down. And then he goes on and says, then to Demetrius, therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen, if you have some kind of complaint against anyone, okay, the courts are open. Okay, bring it before the court. If they've done something, bring it before the court. The courts are open and there are proconsuls. That's what they're for. If I've got a problem, if you're doing something that's damaging my business and I want recourse against that, bring it to the court. That's what that's there for, and that's what the proconsul is for. And he's saying the courts are open. We'll hear your case. Right? We're not going to not let you in. And then he says, let them bring charges against one another. Okay, so bring the charges. So that's what he's telling them. Now in verse 39, in the New King James it says, but if you have any other inquiry to make, and the ESV says, but if you seek anything further, I understand this to be basically is if you're going to bring charges against these guys, bring them to court. If you want some kind of law passed that bans this kind of thing, I think that's what he's saying in verse 39. If you seek something further than just bringing them to court, then it shall be settled in the regular assembly. So that'd be your lawmakers coming together, and you bring this up as we need a law against this kind of thing. And let the assembly take it up and actually write some kind of law. So that's how I'm understanding the two verses. One is take them to court. The other is, if you want something more than just what the court can do, bring it in front of the assembly and let them create some kind of law that bans this thing. But then going back to what Brother Jim said just a second ago, look at verse 40, okay? For we really are in danger. This has been going on for 2 hours, okay? For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today. So this is one of those verses where when we talk about the Passover in Jerusalem, and you've got Pilate coming into Jerusalem, you got Herod coming into Jerusalem. They all live out on a nice villa on the Mediterranean Sea, but they'll all come into Jerusalem during the Passover. So if things get out of hand, they're there. And we'll knock this out right now. And they'll bring out a whole, 1,000 soldiers, and they'll wipe everybody out. They will not allow this rioting. And this is one of those places where we get that from. He says here that we are in danger of being charged with rioting since there is no cause that we can give to justify what you're doing, basically. So if the Romans were to walk in here and say, what's going on here? There's no cause. You have no justification for what you're doing right now. And he's saying, we are really in danger here. Okay, so he's telling them, calm down. So finally in verse 41, and we're right on time, he said, then when he had seen these things, he dismissed the assembly. Okay, so anyway, that's a good account of what happened there in Ephesus, and we'll see that Paul is getting ready to leave the city. But do we have any comments or questions? I mean, we're actually just out of time, but if we hurry up, Brother Wynn has a question or a comment.
One thing I noticed in what he's telling these people at the end here is when he's talking about the Romans coming in, it's sort of one of the things where the only threat bigger to Demetrius and the craftsmen's business than Paul and them is the Romans, because if the Romans come in and
That's right.
so it's sort of like you didn't think that through, did you?
Right, that's like the last thing you want is for the Romans to come in. Good. Okay, thank you very much for your comments and questions. We'll pick up with chapter 20 next week. Thank you.